Imagine this. A child runs barefoot through a burning village. Behind him, screams, smoke, gunfire. His home, gone. His family, missing. In the distance, foreign voices bark orders in a language he doesn't understand. He's not a soldier. He's not a threat. He's 7. But to the men in gleaming armor, muskets in hand and VOC insignias on their chests, he's part of the problem. A problem they've come to erase. This isn't fiction. This is history. And all of it was over a spice. Nutmeg. The miracle spice. The golden seed. The flavor of the elite. And the fuel of empire. This is the untold story of how nutmeg led to one of history's first corporate genocides, the Banda Massacre. A story of blood, greed, and the terrifying power of capitalism unleashed without mercy. In the 1600s, Europe was obsessed with nutmeg. It wasn't just a spice, it was a myth, a cure for the Black Death, an aphrodisiac, a symbol of wealth, a defense against evil spirits, a food preserver, a perfume, a potion. For the elite, nutmeg became an addiction. They carried silver graters in their pockets. They shaved it into their wine, dusted it on roasted meats, mixed it into tonics. A few grains could sell for the price of a cow. And there was only one place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally, a remote group of islands in Southeast Asia, the Banda Islands, tiny, volcanic, barely a dot on a map. But to Europe, they were priceless. To the world's rising empires, they were everything. Whoever controlled Banda controlled nutmeg, and whoever controlled nutmeg controlled wealth, medicine, and global trade. In 1602, the Dutch Republic founded something new, something dangerous. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It wasn't just a trading company, it was a machine. The world's first true multinational corporation, with shareholders, a board of directors, and a license to kill. It had its own private navy and army. It could wage war, colonize, imprison, and execute, all in the name of profit. And it had one mission: dominate the spice trade. The Banda Islands were the crown jewel, but there was a problem. The Bandanese people were not naive. For centuries, they had traded freely with Arab, Indian, Chinese, and Portuguese merchants. They were seasoned negotiators, proud and independent. They refused to grant the VOC a monopoly. They believed in open trade, a free market. But the VOC didn't believe in free markets. It believed in control, and it would stop at nothing to get it. In 1621, the Banda Islands saw sails on the horizon. Not traders, not friends, but warships. At their head was a man whose name would become synonymous with terror: Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the Governor-General of the Dutch East India Company. Cohen wasn't a king. He wasn't even a general by traditional standards. He was a bureaucrat with an army, a corporate man with a crusader's zeal. In Amsterdam, he was seen as brilliant, bold, a visionary of trade and empire. But to those who stood in his way, he was something else entirely: a fanatic. He was just 40 years old, but already infamous. In the Moluccas, he'd crushed resistance with fire and steel. He believed the VOC's divine right to monopoly was God's will, and anyone who opposed it was not just a rival, but an enemy of civilization itself. He saw the Banda Islands not as someone else's home, but as a commodity, a broken machine in need of fixing. And if that meant wiping out the people who lived there, so be it. Cohen didn't come to negotiate. He arrived with over 1,600 soldiers and mercenaries, battle-hardened men armed with muskets, swords, and cannons. Alongside them came artillery, powder, shackles, and VOC clerks ready to draft contracts over conquered soil. Cohen's mission was clear: break the Bandanese. He sent emissaries to the Bandanese leaders with an ultimatum: sign an exclusive trade treaty with the VOC, surrender your independence, hand over your spice, submit. The Bandanese refused. Again, they had seen the violence the VOC brought elsewhere. They knew that monopoly meant servitude. They chose dignity over safety, and that, for Cohen, was unacceptable. So he made a decision: not to wait, not to blockade, not to threaten again, but to eradicate, to burn the villages, to silence the resistance, to remove the problem, not through diplomacy, but through destruction. In Cohen's eyes, Banda was not a community of families, of culture, of history. It was an obstacle in the path of profit, and he was there to clear the path by any means necessary. The campaign began with terror. Villages were surrounded and set ablaze. Crops and orchards were burned to the ground. Livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. Resistance fighters were executed. But this wasn't war. This was systematic annihilation. Bandanese who fled into the jungle were tracked and hunted. Survivors were offered safety if they surrendered, only to be tortured or enslaved. On the island of Lontor, Cohen invited 44 village elders for peace talks. When they arrived, they were bound and beheaded in front of their families, their heads displayed publicly. The message was clear: obey or vanish. Children were captured and taken as hostages. Women were raped or enslaved. Entire communities were erased in a matter of days. The VOC called it pacification, but history should call it what it was: genocide. By the end of the campaign, an estimated 14,000 to 15,000 Bandanese were dead. Some were killed directly, others starved or succumbed to disease and despair. By 1622, only about 1,000 remained. With the land cleared and the Bandanese either dead, enslaved, or scattered, the VOC wasted no time. They took everything. Nutmeg orchards that had belonged to families for generations were now seized as company property. Entire islands were reclassified as VOC territory, not through treaties, not through diplomacy, but through blood and conquest. The jungle was carved into grids, the coastline fortified. Harbors that once welcomed merchants from across Asia now flew the Dutch flag. What remained of Banda was restructured like a machine: efficient, exploitative, and ruthlessly productive. The VOC established vast nutmeg plantations, called perken. These were not farms in any traditional sense. They were industrial spice factories, carved out of paradise, designed for one purpose: maximum extraction. The perken were handed out to a new class of Dutch colonists, the perkeneers. These were not nobles or knights. They were merchants, adventurers, and profiteers, men who saw opportunity in the ashes. Each was assigned a tract of land and charged with growing nutmeg for the company. But there was one problem: no labor force. The Bandanese, the original cultivators of the nutmeg trees, were gone, dead, enslaved, or driven into hiding. So the VOC turned to the global slave trade. They began importing enslaved people from across Asia and Africa, from Java, Sulawesi, India, Bengal, Timor, and Madagascar. Entire communities were raided or bought, loaded into ships like cargo, and dragged across the sea to Banda. Many never survived the journey. The conditions in the holds were horrific: chained in darkness, suffocating in heat and filth, crammed together without room to lie down. Disease swept through the decks like fire. Dysentery, fever, starvation, suicide. Those who lived arrived broken, stripped of their homes, languages, and freedom, only to be thrust into an island of ghosts where death lingered in the trees. On Banda, life was no better. Men, women, and even children were forced to work long hours in brutal heat, climbing volcanic slopes, harvesting nutmeg under the watch of armed guards. There was no rest, no rights. Escape was nearly impossible. The islands were surrounded by ocean and watched day and night. Those who fell behind were beaten. Those who rebelled were executed. Many died within months from exhaustion, tropical disease, or sheer despair. Graves dotted the plantation edges. Some weren't buried at all. The VOC kept careful records of spice yields, shipping costs, and export prices. But it did not record the names of the dead. Back in Europe, however, the profits were impossible to ignore. Nutmeg that cost mere pennies to produce was sold in London, Paris, and Amsterdam for up to 600 times its production cost. It was packaged in polished boxes, advertised as medicine, sold in apothecaries and luxury markets. The VOC's earnings exploded. Dividends were paid out like clockwork. Investors in the Netherlands grew rich. Cities like Amsterdam flourished on the back of spice, its canals lined with merchant houses built with Banda's blood. At its height, the Dutch East India Company became the richest corporation in human history. Adjusted for inflation, its value would eclipse Amazon, Apple, and Google combined, possibly even more. And yet behind every silver guilder was a story not of innovation or entrepreneurship, but of mass murder, slavery, and systematic dehumanization. Behind every crate of nutmeg stood charred villages, severed heads, and stolen lives. It wasn't just a trade route. It wasn't just colonization. It was a machine of extraction, oiled by suffering, and designed to turn pain into profit. In the Netherlands, Cohen was celebrated as a visionary, a national hero, a builder of empire. His statue still stands in Hoorn. Schools and streets bear his name. The massacre, reduced to a footnote, sanitized as colonial enforcement or economic expansion. For centuries, no one was held accountable. No reparations, no apology. The VOC was eventually dissolved in the late 1700s, not because of morality, but because of mismanagement. But in Banda, the story never died. Islanders passed it down through whispered stories and solemn traditions. The trauma was generational. They remembered the forests that went silent, the graves unmarked, the ancestors who vanished. The land still grows nutmeg, but it grows from blood-soaked soil. Today, the Banda Islands are quiet again. Tourists come for diving and sunsets, unaware of what once happened here. Nutmeg is cheap. It sits on grocery store shelves in plastic jars. It's sprinkled on lattes and baked into pies, but few remember that it once cost thousands of lives. The VOC is still studied in business schools, praised for its innovations, the first stock exchange, joint stock companies, globalization. But what's left out is what it pioneered just as effectively. Corporate conquest, state-sponsored violence, genocide for profit. The Banda Massacre was not an accident. It was not a misstep. It was a business strategy. The next time you smell nutmeg, that sweet warm aroma in your kitchen, your coffee, your holiday treats, remember that scent once rose from burning villages. That spice was once bought with lives. History is not just a list of dates and treaties. It is a story of choices. And in 1621, the Dutch East India Company chose profit over humanity. And for that choice, an entire people was nearly erased. The Banda Islands remember. And now, so do you. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Subscribe for more untold histories the world tried to forget.